much. Thank you. It's a pleasure for both Lee and I to introduce Roan Parrish, the amazing Roan Parrish, today. In addition to what I'm about to say, I would like to first mention that I really like Roan. She's a thoughtful, she's kind, smart, hardworking person with a fun sense of humor, ever interesting Zoom backgrounds, and she likes cats. And that's just a big plus. I first met Roan in 2018 in a bioethics seminar, and I was immediately impressed by Roan's her acute analytical skills. I don't recall the details, but I remember this impression was really kind of kilned when we were talking about clinical equipoise. I don't remember what she said, but I do remember that it was like, I thought, wow, this is a bright person. She's like a careful and insightful thinker. I wish I remembered what she said, but in any case, I'm very happy Roan enrolled in the Death Technology and Culture course that I took, the seminar or that I taught in 2021. It's always good to have you in class. The Department of Neuroscience at VT was sure happy to have her as an undergraduate before she enrolled in the STS program. She's not just an excellent student, she also has served the department and the university community in important ways, while also taking on leadership roles amongst graduate students. She has served on the Graduate Student Assembly, STS Graduate Student Organization, our department's policy committee, and the Campus Accessibility Working Group. I'm very grateful to Roan, and you should be too, for working diligently to support a graduate student living wage. As a member and co-chair of the Disability Caucus, she has, and I quote Ashley Shue here, Roan's impact has been outsized, and as she has shared important information and helped us, the caucus, in coordinating ourselves with our other organizations, especially around disability and student interests. It's no wonder that in 2024, the same year that Roan won the Graduate Student of the Year Award, I suggested that the awards committee think about a Graduate Student Career Award, and that I would nominate Roan for it, but they never got back to me on that. So in addition to that, she was also awarded the, let's see, what is it? The Joan Cahalan, did I say that right? Cahalan Robinson Prize? I think we just know it as the Robinson Prize, right? Yeah. Which is awarded to a graduate student or early career scholar presenting at SHOT, the annual meeting, for the first time. She won this award for presenting research from her dissertation, to which Lee Vinzel will now speak. Thanks.
Well, hi, everybody. So one of the things that's been great about being on Roan's committee is getting to work with Phil. It's been a lot of fun co-advising with Phil. I was at SHOT in Los Angeles when they read Roan's name as the award winner, and I think I was looking down at my program, and all of a sudden this sound came out of me that was like, yeah! And then I was like kind of shocked for a second that had just come out of me because I didn't do it on purpose. In retrospect, I think it was like the proud dad sound or something like that is what happened, and it was, not only was that an amazing moment, but seeing Roan at SHOT and seeing so many people see how smart and cool Roan is, and just really being into her project and being super fascinated by it was a really special experience. Because she's already having like some promising nibbles on the job market, one of the amazing things about Roan is she's been teaching at University of Maryland and here a lot, but she also landed a position at Tufts in the spring where she's working with Sam Freed in the STS program. And Nick Seaver, who's this really cool digital STS guy, is in charge of the STS program, works on it with Sam. So I think that's going to be a really great thing. She's writing a dissertation about the history of medical records, and she's going to tell you about that. So I'm going to let her take it away at this point. So yeah, Roan.
Hi. Hi, I have the best co-chairs. They really hype me up. They're great. Highly recommend doing anything with those two. So hi, hello, thank you all for being here. I am here to talk about my dissertation, but only a small part of it. Unfortunately, I could only do so much, and I tried to make this a little bit STSer than I had a shot, which was much more history-oriented. So today I'll give like a small overview of my dissertation. I'm going to talk about Andrew Abbott and professionalization, and then I'm going to fit medical records, and particularly computerized medical records, into professionalization and doctors' reaction to it, and how they felt so distanced from the records that they were using. So in my dissertation, I talk about two cases. I talk about Massachusetts General Hospital, where they had a very long-lasting project working with electronic medical records, implementing them. One of the first electronic medical records, and particularly the language that they wrote, continues. If any of you have heard of Epic medical record software, that uses the language that they made. So I have two chapters dedicated to them. The other case is Lawrence Weed's problem-oriented medical records. He also has an electronic system around it, but the problem-oriented medical records and his really deep view of what medicine should be and how records can structure what medicine as a profession should be are what is important there. I also talk about medical record librarians as the people who need to be organizing all of these medical records, but are completely left out of most of the decision making. Okay. So I'm going to front load some theory onto you so that you can keep it in mind as you listen to the rest. So Andrew Abbott was a sociologist who talked about professions and professionalization. He specifically talked about medicine and lawyers, but in general, his system is very useful for me. So one of the main things that's useful for him is he focuses on the work itself. Many of the sociologists of professionalization focused on like broader social categories of professions, but he really narrowed in on the work itself and control of work. So for example, doctors were the only ones who could input doctors' orders into, or like prescribe things to patients. That's controlling the work. In order to do so, they have to establish jurisdiction over their work and the related knowledge. The knowledge base is also important. So we have classifying problem, which is diagnosing. Now keep in mind that diagnosing in this case is a little bit different from doctors diagnosing. Same word used in two ways, always the best. Reason about a problem or infer, and then taking action about that problem or treating it. This one is more of the classical doctor treatment. He also distinguishes between lay knowledge systems, professional knowledge systems, and academic knowledge systems. So lay systems are like the general public knows what a cold is. It knows how to handle a cut. It knows when they're in over their head and should go to the doctor. The professional system is the things that they're actually doing, the skills that they learn, and how to interpret the academic knowledge. It's what they use on a daily basis. And then academic knowledge is what we know and love. It is often divorced from the practice because it is more focused on disassembling the object of research itself, which is the human body, or the patient, or the disease, or the condition, whatever it happens to be. So we have these three different systems. Diagnosis and treatment are both mediating acts. So they are taking information from the patient and putting it into the knowledge system, and then taking instructions back out. Inference is a purely professional act, as he puts it, where it is this skillful and expertise-based interpretation and decision-making. So it is much more about the expert doing the work rather than having the knowledge and moving in and out. So that's what the physicians really feel the need to defend the boundaries around the most, because inference is what makes them a profession and therefore allows them to maintain their authority. Okay, so that's a lot of theory, just shoving that at you. Keep it in mind, in the back of your mind as you listen. So we're talking about medical records. It's useful to think about what medical records are, which, you know, is kind of cheating. We can talk about what the definition of medical records are for days, but it's useful because that's kind of the core of the design problem between these two cases. What are medical records? What information do they need in order to work? Who are they supposed to be for? And what are they doing for medicine and in medicine? So in the 1910s, they were commonly used by surgeons as evidence of the care that they're providing in order to get licensure and certification from the American College of Surgeons, and it's also used by hospitals as a log of activities. In the 1920s and 1930s, this usage expanded and became part of certification and accreditation requirements for both physicians and hospitals. So this use focused on the medical practitioner and the medical institution. So the medical record was proof of care. However, as more and more diagnostic tests became available, as medical research thrived, records became thicker, denser, and more difficult to organize, and physicians saw more patients as insurance became more and more available, as hospitals had more patients moving through their system. The physicians used this as memory. It was a way to remember what patients did, what they had, and what they had been in there before. But this was more of a per physician, per practitioner oriented memory. So it was used for the physician to jog their memory about the patient rather than for the record to move from physician to physician to physician and communicate about them. So the record was memory. By the 1960s, the time frame in which my cases really kick off, medical care had become really, really complicated. We had tons of research, which is great, but now everyone needs to remember all of the results of that research. They need to incorporate it into their existing practices and produce new material out of it, which is really, really hard. So then you get specialists. We have fewer general practitioners, which is a common problem today, and people became more and more specialized. This meant that you had medical teams, particularly as hospitals centralized medical care, particularly around the very expensive diagnostic equipment and diagnostic labs, and the high-end administrative departments required to get through insurance and through Medicaid. So we had more and more teams, and the medical record had to communicate across that team. You might have 5 people working with the same patient, and that record had to inform each of the 5 members about exactly what they needed to know. So there was a push to standardize medical records. Instead of having physicians just write whatever is useful for them, you had to have certain elements of data in order to represent that patient effectively. So the medical record was communication. To provide an idea of the sheer amount of information being created and communicated, consider this 1965 report from Massachusetts General Hospital. The records room had 1,350,000 records. Just since 1937, they had more from before that were stored separately. An average day had 150 new patients' records issued and over 4,000 demands for existing records. For each patient admitted, information was sent to 20 to 30 different areas of the hospital. Innumerable phone calls between patient care areas, labs, and physician offices coordinated the care. The chemistry lab, one of the major labs, fielded 212 telephone calls regarding test results in a single 12-hour period. Lab results were typically communicated via slips of paper carried by hand to other areas of the hospital, usually at the end of the day in one big package, which meant that doctors didn't see it until the next morning in order to actually act on it. Over 5,000 doctor's orders were written in a day, and the author of the report estimated that 50,000 separate data items were entered into patient records each day, nearly 20 million a year. While many of the papers were typed, many more were handwritten and unintelligible. So the medical record was chaos. And throughout all of this, we also have the physicality, the material of the record. They were primarily paper. We did also have microfiche and microfilm records, when ones that aren't actively in use, that were maybe out of use for a couple years, were put onto longer term storage and then had to be pulled back out if the patient returned, like if they're there for a lifetime's worth of care. So you end up with tons and tons and tons of storage. This is a tiny records room. This is just a very small clinic size records room. Hospitals had thousands of these shelves. So the medical record was space. And for the purposes of my narrative today, I'm going to stop there and not go into hospital administration or record librarians or law and court uses because they were legal entities as well, or public health agencies or other state federal agencies. If you want to know that, you can read my dissertation. So medical records were changing. They're changing alongside medical practice and alongside medical practitioners, but maybe we need to be more intentional about how they are changing. If they are in flux, we need to put in the work to shape them to what we need them to be, both for our present practices and for our future. Because medicine is going to continue to change, and the question becomes, do we make our records shape what our practices are now, today, or do we make them long-lasting for the future? Because we're also getting new technologies. So if we design them with our new technologies and we make them geared towards long use, then we can have control over it. And this is a common design question of, do we design for what we need right now, or do we design for the future? That's how we got Surge, a building that was supposed to last a couple years and is still there. But while it's like a very classic design question, it's also very useful. My cases for today have two different ideas of what the answer should be, but thankfully, they both agree that the records should be computerized. The computer! Computers will solve everything. The computer is a wonderful, novel new creation that can hold so much information, a couple megabytes, so much information. It can do everything we need. Information overload's a problem? Don't worry, we'll just store it on tapes. Storage problems, reels of tapes are smaller than paper. And once we get into floppy disks, oh, those are even smaller than folders. Okay, sure, a computer takes up a whole room all on its own, but it's stored off-site, so it's fine. We've got terminals, so that different people can all access the same record at the same time. When you have those 20 to 30 different areas, it's really useful to have terminals instead of trying to share one page across that many different people. And okay, yeah, maybe the transition stage will be a little bit bumpy, but once people see what computers have to offer, they're going to be so happy to have computers take over. Okay, maybe not so much. At Massachusetts General Hospital, the director of the computer lab, G. Octo Barnett, was a doctor. He was a physician who happened to like computers. This is important because often when we think about this, we think of the dissonance between the doctor doing things and then the computer person doing things, and they don't understand each other. No, this is one person who had both sets of expertise. So he had the lab of computer science given to him in 1962, brand new lab. He wanted to make a small system to get started, to figure out what they needed to do. So they created a laboratory reporting system. Very straightforward. They installed teletypes, like these ones, at nurses' stations and in the lab. The way teletypes work is it prints things out onto paper. You don't have like a monitor to work with. It is typing. It is like a typewriter that types on paper. Nurses were told that this was their new way to order lab test results, order lab tests and receive the results. So he knew that they would need some training on computer commands and how to type, but he didn't think that it would be much more complicated than the existing paper system. If anything, it should be more simple because it's centralized. Now, as SDSers, we kind of expect that this was less than successful, but to their credit, they did succeed in replicating or improving paper record methods in some ways. They did succeed in having all the forms that needed to be printed in triplicate or more be automatically routed to their destinations with no problem. That did work. They did successfully have the records come to the nurse's station in a timely manner instead of having a courier bring them every evening, so doctors could actually respond quickly to emergency cases instead of having couriers have to handle things. So they did have some successes, to their credit. But the problems were more numerous than the successes. First of all, these nurses had never seen a computer. They had mostly never taken a typing class. And while typing is women's work, that doesn't mean that all women learn how to type. So they saw a typewriter that typed at them noisily. These were very noisy and had to be put into boxes to separate out the noise. They had been told that this was their new lab reporting system, but not what that meant. There was a complete lack of a shared foundation of expectations of what the machine was actually supposed to do in terms of concrete tasks. This is illustrated in an anecdote shared by Barnett in a later oral history. A nurse called up Barnett, struggling with the terminal, trying to figure out how to get these reporting shenanigans started, and asks, "Hey, where am I supposed to pour the blood in this?" Now, to people who know and understand computers, this seems like a silly question, because the computer is just a communication mechanism. But as far as the nurse knows, it's just a machine. The lab machines analyze blood all the time. Why shouldn't this do the same? Why shouldn't it be she pours the blood in there, it does the analysis, and it sends it to the lab for interpretation? There's no reason that she wouldn't believe that it would be the case. And this was supposed to be a paper-free replacement. All specimens are required to have paper attached. If this is supposed to be paper-free, then how is she supposed to label the specimen and get it to the lab and have them know what they're getting? Obviously, if there's no paper, it has to be done immediately in front of her. So here's an example of how there's like a dissonance between what care and what is known about it, what the professional tasks are. But it's also important about how paper is woven into everything. Paper is part of everyday procedures in a way that computers simply cannot replicate. Medication charts went on rounds attached to the cart that the nurses could roll from bed to bed. Terminals were heavy and loud and attached to wires that could not be moved. So the computer's strengths were also its weaknesses. One of the biggest benefits to paper was that everybody already knew how to write. In order to become a medical member or an administrative staff member, you have to know how to write. But not everyone knew how to type, and most of them didn't want to learn how to type, particularly the men, and doctors were mostly men. Doctors wanted to dictate. They didn't even want to write anymore. They wanted to dictate all of the information that they could to have a typist then listen to it on the recorded device and create the forms for them. Nurses wanted to write out quick numbers and jump around on the page on the forms that they were already familiar with so that as the patient is speaking to them, they can fill out the different parts as is relevant rather than stopping the patient and saying, hey, the computer's asking me a different question. I need to answer this question before I can move forward into what you're telling me. So there's this constriction in the computer. If the computer asks things in a certain order, it requires information to be provided in a certain format, but the patient doesn't provide things in that format, and the nurses and doctors have to navigate the computer and the patient at the same time in a way that paper is much more flexible about handling. So maybe instead of replacing paper with electronic medical records, we can have both. Barnett decided that instead of forcing doctors to learn how to type, and instead of forcing nurses to learn computer commands, paper would act as a buffer. The computer would house all the information, typists would have to enter and retrieve the data, but administrative staff already knew how to type, not too bad. The admin would print out schedules and records for each day's planned appointments, and they would enter the data back into the computer at a set time, and everything would be organized, and everyone would be happy, right? Well, it turns out hospitals are really complicated, and this only works if you're in a small clinic. So Barnett got kicked out of MGH, not all the way out, he still worked at MGH, but his system got kicked out and moved to the Harvard clinic, where everything was much more controlled. It was much smaller, it was a healthcare community clinic, and everything was set appointments. They knew who would be coming in ahead of time, they could have all the forms prepared ahead of time, and there was much less ambiguity. By removing the ambiguity of what care would be happening at any point in time, they were able to structure it such that the computer was capable of handling it. The doctors at MGH refused to engage with the computer, and they offset the labor back onto the nurses. The nurses refused to have it offset back onto them and pushed it back to the doctors. And so Barnett moved all of that work onto the typists, who didn't have a choice. By keeping the medical practitioners separated from the computer, medical records remained passive. Paper is passive. Paper does not beep at you. It does not demand that you answer certain questions before you move on to the next one. It does not prompt you to make decisions or recommend specific treatment plans or guide you to the next stage of diagnosis. Paper can be skipped. You can write in the margins and ignore the format on the page. Whereas computers are active. Computers do demand. The key characteristic of demand is very important for my other case, Lawrence Weed. So Weed was also a doctor, a medical doctor. He was a practicing physician at the University of Vermont, and he hated the state of medicine in the 1960s. It was deplorable and chaotic, and there was simply too much information. He didn't just see computers as a way to solve the information overload, but rather he saw computers as the future of medicine because physicians would become problem solvers instead of knowledge bases. It If the problem with medicine was that medical students and licensed physicians couldn't learn all of the content and they had to keep specializing because there was just too much to know, then put that information in the computer and have the physicians just be able to work with and analyze the information instead. The computer can find patterns. The computer can make connections. The human can interpret the patient and translate the patient into terms that the computer can understand, and then analyze the computer's results and apply that logic back to the patient in diagnosis and treatment. So we're back to the computer being the solution. This time we're actually sticking with it being the solution. In Weed's vision, the computer will solve everything in medicine as a profession and as a practice. The computer will become an active and interactive agent in clinical decision making, and every part of the patient's data will be analyzed by the computer. The records and the computer become the core of care. It isn't just record keeping, it's analysis. He explicitly states that the medical record should include the entire logic of a physician's decision making, both in paper and on the computer, because how else are you going to communicate with others? How else are you going to explain what you're doing and how you're doing it? So the medical record is logic. The medical record is activity. Now this would require the entirety of medical knowledge, the entire medical library, to be in one accessible and linked computer library. Even more, as medical research is performed, all of that knowledge would need to be updated and maintained, and as new clinical guidelines come out, you need to update it. And if any of you have ever had to maintain any kind of knowledge base, you know that that is a wild and unreasonable expectation. It is so much work. That is just so much labor to maintain even just one computer system, but the entirety of medical knowledge. Imagine trying to incorporate every medical journal with every single issue that comes out into this library. So it's an unreasonable amount of labor, but he doesn't know that yet. It's the 1960s, he'll learn. So he sees the computer as the answer to information overload and to the deepening cracks in the profession of medicine as specializations separate. So he envisions the physician enters the patient's data into the computer beep boop processes, and then the computer would suggest options or prompt for further information or reminds him what not to do. The computer would enter into an interactive dialogue with the physician. This would require direct contact. You cannot use paper as a buffer if the computer is going to be interacting with the physician and with medicine. So this interactive element of the computer asking questions, making suggestions, and interrupting is the clinical decision-making system. The decisions would be informed by medical experts, like the existing clinical guidelines. So everything would have a basis in human professional work, but the computer would implement these on a case-by-case basis in clinical encounters. Over time, this method of offloading information would shift the role of the physician to more of a problem solver rather than a knowledge expert, which means that the deep content knowledge that was prized and valued by physicians at the time would become devalued. With the burgeoning amount of medical research, it is simply impractical for a doctor to become an expert anymore. So instead of changing medical research, change the physician. Change what the physician should be doing and what role they hold in medicine. Okay, so let's bring Abbott back into the story. I've shown you a snippet of Barnett at MGH and a snippet of Weed with his problem-oriented system. Both of these are, just like as a little spoiler, both of these systems did fail, but both of them succeeded in different ways as well. So let's use Abbott's professions framework to think about why. So diagnosis is the process of turning the patient into information, what I described about putting the patient into the record. The doctor does not need nor want the entirety of a patient because that is simply too much information to be useful. Instead, he picks out the pieces that might be helpful in solving the clinical problem. This typically involves a level of interpretation, of translating the patient into clinically digestible descriptions or quantifications. There are two components to diagnosis, in Abbott's terms of diagnosis. Colligation, in which the clinical identity of the patient is assembled, and classification, in which they are placed into a diagnostic category. So colligation is the set of rules by which a patient is identified. What evidence is valid or invalid? What data is necessary or extraneous? When you're telling a doctor how you got an injury and they skip past the majority of what you said to focus in on only a specific portion of your story, that's colligation in action. So medical records are colligation. They structure colligation. Medical records are a barrier through which information must pass in order to become official and valid and retained. This is true of both paper and computer records, but computers raise that barrier. Computers impose stricter demands on data type and length and absence or presence. Paper has flexibility and adaptability. The form itself may be the same for both a computer and a paper record, but data boxes can be skipped or scribbled out, or the physician can add comments in the margins. Those comments may not be parsable into the professional knowledge system, but they remain for the professional themselves so that they can use them in the future when the patient comes back. Barnett tries to get the best of both worlds here. You see here an encounter form where he has a paper form that acts as a buffer for the physician to use in the clinical encounter, but you also see that there's all these numbers, all these letters, all these codes structuring the information so that it can be easily put into the computer later. So they'll fill this out and then they'll give it to a typist who will put this into the computer. And it also meets the computer's needs because instead of having to type out all of that long words, their storage space was at a premium. They didn't want to have all this text. So instead, everything was coded so the computer had less to remember. So he created this system that still mostly matched the practices that they already had in place, with slightly stricter and a little bit more constrained. As you can see, there's also a free text for diagnoses that the physicians demanded to have so that they could add their own material in there if it didn't quite fit into the earlier sections. Weed, on the other hand, did not want this. He wanted the computers to be immediately forefront in your face. Doctors got to work with them. So he would have a physician go back and forth between the patient and the computer, reading the patient, translating the patient into medical terms, and entering that data into the computer in the order that the questions are asked, which is a logical order. All of it's all very logic-based. And the physician would still be completing most of the aspects of colligation. The computer couldn't do physical exams yet. You know, one day if they could, Weed would be all over that. But the computer couldn't handle all of like natural language processing that would be required for free text to be entered. So the physician could only put in what structure was already present. The physician would become a skilled technician, following the computer's guidance, rather than a profession using their own inference and knowledge. The computer would also complete the classification step, in which the assemblage of information from colligation would be compared against the dictionary of possible diagnoses. The computer may come up with multiple possible diagnoses, leaving some of the thinking to the physician, but the computer would also suggest the next steps in order to start excluding some of those possibilities. This exclusion actually takes us to our next phase after diagnosis, into inference. Sometimes the connection between diagnosis and treatment is obvious. You break your arm, you set it, you fix it. You have appendicitis, yank that thing out. Often, however, the set of signs and symptoms matches an overlapping set of diagnoses, particularly since not all of the information that you gather will actually be relevant to the problem you're trying to solve in front of you. So this is where the purest, professional, expert, skillful work lies, analyzing and interpreting and making decisions based on the nuances of the patient in front of you and the probabilities and their lives. This is what doctors want. This is the work that they most closely identify with and that only they can do, they think, they want. The work that centers their professional boundaries. It's one thing for computers to do some data processing or information handling for them, but it's quite another for them to think for the doctors. That's threatening. That is threat territory for their profession. The actual degree to which computers contribute to inference has a broad range. We can keep some fuzzy boundaries between diagnosis, inference, and treatment here because they overlap in the actual activities and because Abbott does. What's important is not so much whether the computer is inferring for the doctor, but rather whether the doctor feels that his inferences are being intruded upon by the computer. With Weed's clinical decision-making system, this is very clearly occurring. This is intentional. He wants that. The computer isn't completely taking over inference because the doctor still needs to apply what the computer says and decide whether or not to follow through on recommendations. But the very act of recommending certain diagnostic tests and treatments in order to narrow down possibilities is inference by the computer. And I keep saying computer, and it sounds like the computer is the main actor here instead of records, but it's important to keep in mind that the records are the interface between the physician and the computer knowledge base. The records and the clinical decision-making system are interwoven. If the physician says their main symptom is rashes, the computer can immediately respond saying, "Have you checked for allergies?" For Barnett, he did actually try to put a little bit of this into his initial hospital computer project for Massachusetts General Hospital by having a few programs where doctors did directly interact with the terminals. There was such a strong rejection that he took that interaction out of his next few projects. There was a story that may or may not have been true that a resident threw a terminal out of a window because it was so frustrating. Because Barnett shifted to a paper intermediary between the physician and the computer, it was much more difficult for the computer to have any inferential input. Instead, it functioned much more like a doctor going to the medical library and finding books, finding more information, making the choice to get more information instead of having the information and options thrust upon him. So now we come to treatment. The computers couldn't actually perform treatments yet. They couldn't perform surgeries. They couldn't wrap bandages. They couldn't do daily care. But they could and did recommend care. And they could and did counter the physician's orders. As you might imagine, having a computer refute your order was not particularly popular with the doctors. Take, for example, a medication ordering system Barnett placed in Massachusetts General Hospital around 1965. Doctors would input their prescriptions or treatment orders into the computer, much like into the doctor's orders book. Then they would be automatically routed to the departments that would handle the next steps, like the pharmacy or the nurse's station. It's just an electronic version of the doctor's book, except the computer talked back. The drug formulary library within the program recognized contraindications, which were written by the pharmacy, but the computer is the one reporting on them. Contraindications are drugs that should not be prescribed together. So this is a fairly standard feature today in order to protect patient health, but it was novel at that point. Computers themselves were novel and weird. So if a doctor input a medication combination that was contraindicated, or a medication that interfered with an existing prescription for that patient, the computer would reply with an alert. It would flag it. It would ask if they were sure if they wanted to do this, and it may recommend a different option. It also flagged anything it didn't recognize as a standard order, including a double order spread out so as to get a balanced load. Doctors hated this. They felt that a computer second-guessing their work was an affront to their authority, because prescribing treatment is a privilege of authority. It is a privilege of the profession, and it is a representation of that profession's actions and boundaries. These doctors didn't go through years of medical school and residency and get a prestigious position at a top hospital just to have some machine tell them that they're wrong. This is one of the reasons why it was much better at the clinic, because the clinic had like normal level doctors, not high-end arrogant doctors. At least when a pharmacist recognized potential problems with a prescribed treatment, they would call the doctor and then they would have a dialogue between two professionals so they could work it out, and there was respect on both ends, usually. It also removed some of the professional expertise from the nurse. Commonly, the physician would put a more vague order into the handwritten book and expect the nurse to have the knowledge and expertise to interpret it, to extrapolate the missing pieces, or to implement it as needed for the patient. Like if it's pain medication, the nurse could pay attention to the patient and recognize, do they need a full load of painkillers or only half a thing of painkillers based on actual care. Whereas, because the computer required every single detail, it took that adaptability away from the nurse. If the nurse didn't do every single detail that was provided there, then the record is there. If something goes wrong with the patient, she is in legal trouble, because medical records are also legal entities. I realize I'm not really talking about that today, but you know. So this put more of the task onto the doctor instead of on the nurse. The doctor had to do the complete task instead of sharing the load with the nurse. This also feeds into the earlier section of inference. Like I said, they're not necessarily completely separate, because there is a level of interpretation work going on here that isn't represented just in treatment. So Abbott defines diagnosis and treatment as putting information into the professional knowledge system and taking information or instructions out, which requires having a professional knowledge system. So the professional knowledge system is necessary in order to maintain the boundaries of the profession, and keeping it relatively private, locked down, is necessary for the authority to continue. You don't want to have unlicensed people performing medicine, because then it removes some of that authority. So this may be a little bit less obvious to us today in the ways of WebMD and Mayo Clinic having all of their information, medical library up available to us, but academic journals are still paywalled, and med school and residency, the actual professional side of the knowledge system, continue to be locked away. Maintaining that sufficient barrier of limiting access and limiting accreditation allows them to maintain their prestige and their higher level of authority. Barnett's projects didn't really do much to impact that professional knowledge. While his lab did have many projects around medical library and medical education, they were within the existing system. You had to already be in med school. You had to already be in the hospital in order to access these. So you already had access to the knowledge. It was just a new medium to access that knowledge. Whereas Weed really wanted to make that knowledge as accessible as possible. And he did succeed in some ways. He put the entirety of his hospital's procedures into the computer, and so nurses could look at doctors' procedures, and doctors could look at nurses' procedures. And sometimes that was fine. The doctors looked at some of the procedures after a minor surgical operation and said, oh, you don't actually need to observe them for that long. You can have a more efficient policy here and let them out sooner, and then it's less work for the nurses. Great. Good, love improving medical care. But then the nurses also looked at the doctor's policies and procedures and started asking questions and started wondering about what the doctors were doing and why, and wanted to actually talk to the doctors about how they were doing things, which would almost certainly improve medical care if the doctors responded. But the doctors felt that as a threat to their authority, because doctors and nurses are on different levels. Doctors can talk down to nurses. Nurses can't talk up. That's all bad. So it creates this dialogue between professional knowledge bases that allows a lessening of authority in perception. Effectively, probably wouldn't do that, but the doctors perceive it as a threat to their knowledge base. So in general, this is a computer taking over some work tasks. This is the broad term of it. There were fears of technological unemployment associated with this system. Classic 20th century concern, classic computer concern. Even Barnett's system at Massachusetts General Hospital engendered some fear. A nurse attending some training sessions expressed concern over what the computer would be capable of doing in the future and what would be taken away from them. And the computerized records absolutely did take some tasks away. Nurses no longer had to copy orders from the orders book into their Cardex cards that manage their actual prescriptions. They didn't have to cut and paste laboratory reports into patients' charts anymore. And the computer also added many tasks. Sure, the nurses no longer had to write things out, but they had to type things up instead, and often different reports. The hospital had to hire data entry clerks to manage all of the data that was being created and put into the computer. Doctors had to type. Typing is a skill. I joke about it being a woman's work, but it was a skill that they had to learn and that they had no exposure to previously. They also had to learn how to talk to the computer, which has very different verbiage than talking to your colleagues. When we talk about technological unemployment, we tend to come to the question of what tasks we want to keep and what tasks we are willing to give away to the technologies. We think about the current arguments with AI and creativity. We want to keep creativity for us, not give it to the AI. So maybe we're fine with not pasting records anymore. Maybe we can get used to the computer critiquing our drug orders, which doctors did. That is normal now. Maybe everyone knows how to type now. We can use Abbott's structure of diagnosis, inference, and treatment to think through which tasks are most crucial to keep to maintain professional boundaries and which ones we're willing to parcel out. So physicians reacted most strongly to inference, either actually becoming computerized or being perceived as being computerized, because inference is what it means to be professional. It must be defended in order to maintain their authority. Electronic medical records were most successful when they were felt to complement inference rather than replace it. For example, Barnett's system could be used to generate graphs that showed change over time, allowing the physician to judge responses to treatment and make changes as needed. The doctors also had strong reactions to the visibility of the computer as part of the inference process, as professional boundaries are largely built on society respecting those boundaries. So having a computer terminal in the room, in the clinical encounter, clearly seen by the patient, was sometimes described as off-putting and disruptive, both because it was a physical boundary between the physician and the patient, interrupting that relationship, and because it was perceived as undermining the physician. As we often see with concerns of technological unemployment, we see a redistribution of tasks, not just dissolution of tasks. Barnett had to include data entry clerks and secretaries in order to manage the paper buffer. He also had to add in dictation mechanisms because the doctors just absolutely insisted on dictating, and even when he gave them very clearly outlined forms, they refused to handwrite them. In the hospital computer project, Barnett also had doctors attempt to refuse to interact with the computers by getting the nurses to fill out the orders instead, which they legally were not allowed to do and would lose accreditation for the hospital if they did. So in this redistribution process, there's a back and forth interaction of what tasks you keep, what tasks you give away, and what tasks are forbidden. A lot of the redistribution ended up putting tasks onto the doctors that had previously been placed on scribes, on typists, and on nurses. Part of the dream of electronic medical records is greater ease of use than paper, but instead it takes up more of the doctor's time because they have to do the actual interaction with the records. As far as tasks go, the greatest utility for all is found if the doctor is the one entering the records themselves. It reduces illegible handwriting, notorious problem for doctors. It reduces copy errors as you copy from one page to another or copy from the page into the computer. It reduces misunderstandings of what they actually meant when they scroll down this note. And it allows the computer to react immediately and to flag errors or contraindications and immediately address problems before they're allowed to persist. However, these are not the tasks that the doctor actually wants to have. Those are the tasks that he wants to give away because they're not within his professional boundary. He wants to have the ones that are geared only towards his profession or that actively supplement his professional work rather than things that can be done by a lower profession. The doctor was also never the one organizing data after he put the record together. That was the medical record librarian's job, which means that many of the boons from the computer are benefiting other professions, other jobs, other workers, rather than benefiting the doctor directly. That means that the reduction of tasks does not apply evenly. It is not an even reduction in distribution. Balancing out these tasks and the acceptance of the tasks thus becomes a core concern in designing and implementing electronic medical records and often reflects these professional boundaries. Some tasks simply must be done by the doctors because they are squarely within the professional knowledge system and because they are legally required. Some setups are strongly rejected by the doctors because they threaten those professional boundaries. They threaten their authority and autonomy. And some tasks the doctors don't want and will just push off, and then your expected policies don't work in practice. Some jobs that were predicted to disappear instead warp and change and fit the new system, like scribes and medical record librarians that become health information administrators. They change, their actual tasks, their daily function changes, but the core conception behind it stays. So in conclusion, when we look at Barnett's system, we have a careful patchwork that weaves the computerized medical records into existing procedures, but does not threaten professional boundaries too much. And when a threat is felt, there's compromise. There is work to reduce that threat in order to create buy-in for the system to continue. Medical records were supportive, medical records were memory, and medical records were communication. When we look at Weed's system, we see an attempt to overhaul the larger medical system with the computer as the heart of the operation. We see a solution to the problem that is the medical profession that must be taken in its entirety, or else the existing problems will only continue to grow and fester. Any compromise is only allowing these problems to persist when they should be excised. For Weed, medical records were logic, they were assertive, they were knowledge. I realize this sounds very dramatic and like I'm creating a Barnett good, weed bad dynamic, but I'm not, because neither system succeeded. Neither system is better or worse than the other. They are simply very, very different, and they put different demands on the people working with them. Some of Barnett's technical creations have lasted much longer. MUMPS, the language, is still around. They've had international usage. MUMPS was used in Germany and in Japan quite a bit, and they continue to be used today. But the system itself is gone. It has been gone for at least 20 years. Paper does continue to be used constantly and consistently as an intermediary. I was at the nurse a couple weeks ago doing a routine thing, and the computer simply refused to log in. So everything was written on paper and brought to a different computer. Paper persists. Weed's idea that medical practitioners would have clinical decision-making systems embedded into their records, also true. That is a standard part of care today. They don't always like it that the computer is making decisions for them, but they've learned to use it. He also popularized the problem-oriented medical record, a structure for organizing the medical record that is the basis for how most EHRs organize medicine today. So his thoughts behind it continue even if people don't buy into the entire system he was putting forth, which he would argue means there's still problems. So really my conclusion here is that the more things change, the more things stay the same. As I talked about computers and medicine and technological unemployment, you probably heard the echoes of AI resounding through. This fear isn't new. It's a century old at least, but its flavor changes with each new technology. What tasks is AI taking on? Often the ones that the physicians want. AI can interpret radiological images now. Okay, well that's an expert radiologist skill, and that's already an argument that's been in contestation between radiologists and radio techs, and now they're adding AI into the mix. There's an idea that AI may be able to help with the current problem of physician burnout, which you have in a couple ones here. Record keeping is consistently highlighted as a major contributor to medical provider burnout, but the tasks that the AI does and can take over are not the ones that are contributing to burnout. They're the ones that produce the most joy and satisfaction in most physicians' work. So incorporating AI is likely to increase provider burnout rather than solve it. So in lieu of a happy ending for my narrative, I'm going to pivot into thanking my lovely committee for being wonderful and for putting up with me, particularly my committee chairs, Phil and Lee, y'all are great. Also my cohort, Jack and Ka, and my friends who showed up, which apparently David took off work to show up today. He's on Zoom. Anyways, thank you all.
We have time for some Q&A. If you're on Zoom, you can raise your hand and unmute yourself, or you can submit your question in the chat, and I will read it out loud.
And I'm going to be Lois's mic person. So, we'll start with you.
Great talk. And so my question would be, it seems like you structured the whole talk based on the system professionalization. So, but I also hear a lot of ideas about expertise. So I'm actually wondering, what do you think is the relationship between like system of professionalization and system of experts and expertise, especially against the backdrop of this story? And would you agree that I can just infer that computers in this story themselves are agents of expertise?
I would agree with that last statement for sure, particularly since the computers are supposed to be structured and based on information provided by other experts. So it's supposed to be kind of like an expert mediator, keeping you like, particularly in the 70s when you couldn't as easily just call up an expert and ask questions. You had to actually know them, you had to wait for them. So it allows this expert information to be able to be more accessible to the everyday general practitioner. The relationship, I would say, is in the knowledge system. So the knowledge system that Andrew Abbott points to is the core of creating that professional boundary and separating out from layman knowledge. And that is also the expertise in skill and in knowledge, but also in recognition by the society as expertise.
Thank you. First, I just want to say that this is really superb work, really super impressive. I have a 3-part question. And each of them is a little complicated, so I'll take it one at a time.
Okay.
I mean, the first question is, I kind of get the impression that what you're trying to create here is using systems of the professions as a theory of innovation. The ways in which this interaction between these different groups and then the computer plays into it is shaping the course of change over time. Is that accurate?
I had not thought of it that way, but I can see how that could be accurate. I have not thought of innovation as related to this.
And so let me explain a little bit more why this came to mind, because in the story, the computer doesn't change very much. They're just introduced. And it strikes me that over time, all 3 of these relationships among these people are changing, but presumably future systems are responding and changing in reaction to all of the things you just described. So I think it would be, potentially just really fascinating to see, like, is that something that applies in multiple contexts, and is that something to do with? Okay, so taking that as part 1, in part 2, you really talked about this, like the time dropped out. Like we're just talking about some time in the 1960s. And then you say, like, the more things change, the more they stay the same. It's not a dissertation problem, but what's the long arc? Like what changes? I mean, presumably if there are 20 million records in 1964 or whatever year it was, now there must be, like 2 billion records a day or something like that. So like how can you describe a little bit the long change that comes out of this interaction among these different kind of groups in this system?
Yes, I fully admit that as a history project, this is a complete failure on the chronological time frame. I did that intentionally because I didn't want to try to talk about the different instructions. Yeah. So there's much more of a timeline in the dissertation than there is here. The dissertation is shaped in time and change over time. So I do talk about the hardware a lot more in that, and the software there. So to the point of how things have changed, part of it is the technological capacity for both for what the computer can do and in how people can interact with the computer, because it changed. My time frame kind of ends around like 1990, right before the internet hits, so I don't have to deal with the internet. But the build up there is as people get used to having to work with the computer, it changes how they're willing to interact with the records. But records don't become electronic medical records on a strong basis, like nationwide, until 2008. So there's this gap in what the computers are capable of doing and what we as medicine are willing to actually do. So it doesn't become standardized until 2008 with the High-Tech Act, with Obamacare and all that stuff, where he's like, you have to have meaningful use of electronic medical records. You have to do this. And so we get this push into having electronic medical records. However, we don't have a coherent medical record organization. So right now we have the problem of interoperability. So it's hard for me to say how many medical records there are, because one person has 7 different medical records across the different places. So it's not that one person has one medical record in one place. It's everything is discordant, spread across, even in the same hospital system. So it's like we have the capacity to have much better and more organized and like coherent medical records and harmonized medical records between the users and the computer. But because we have private companies doing it, they don't want that, because then you can easily move from company to company. So then everything, it's hard to say one thing because everyone does it differently. Some medical records have ads in them.
So part 3 is exactly what you've described here. If you were to take the systems of the professions approach and were asked to explain, like, okay, now we have this new problem, we have 7 different systems, how would it help you provide an answer, or would it just be able to say, well, here's why it's going to be messed up in lots of new different ways?
So there's a specific way that I would put it into, actually, in that right now we have certain programs geared towards specific specialists. So we have the program that is best for cardiologists. We have the program that is best for hospital general practitioners. And because we have these ones that are geared towards specific mini professions within the greater profession, it deepened those fractures that Weed was worried about instead of bridging them. Because you can no longer directly move the file from one to the other because the literal data format is different. So I would say that the system of professions helps us see how it gets worse instead of it gets better.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Roan. Just 3 parts? 4th? Okay. Okay. left some things unsaid. Yeah, thanks. So yeah, no, I had some of the same appreciative reaction as Matt had. I thought this was really fantastic. And I hope that in bringing in Abbott and taking this sort of STS turn with the focus on devices, that you're also sort of putting this out as something that extends and adds to Abbott, adds something new that's not there, which is, you know, he looks at the system of professions and these jurisdictional struggles at the level of knowledge, and you're sort of, you know, using STS, thinking about technology to show how this development of devices is itself really important and how jurisdictions are carved out and claimed. So in that spirit, there's another development that in the history and sociology of medicine, this is also sort of something that takes place over time, a development that we're interested in, that I'm sure you thought about, and I wonder how it enters into this, which is the notion of medicalization or biomedicalization, right? The way that progressively more problems become medical problems, which is also a great Abbott issue because it's about medicine taking over more jurisdictions. Would you argue, and it's really sort of, there's intriguing possibilities of the role of medical records in that, because these are devices for turning things into medical problems, right? Through this, what was colligation?
Colligation, yeah.
Was that, does Abbott use that term?
It's
Oh, really?
Abbott's
I don't
term.
remember
Yeah.
that. Okay.
I've never seen it used outside of Abbott.
So would you extend it to the sort of process of medicalization, and then that also suggests a kind of paradox, which is also kind of delicious for Abbott's way of thinking, because he's always talking about how efforts of professions to claim it's this kind of I don't know, military metaphor, almost, to claim some jurisdictions weakens them in other ways, and so they always have to be careful and not overextend, because here you have this device that's involved in turning things into medical problems, but and an expansion of the scope of medicine, but at the same time a kind of loss of autonomy and, I don't know, de-skilling or of medicine. So it has this sort of two-edged sword to it. So can you address the medicalization issue? And
so I would say that for my time frame, it's more medicalization than biomedicalization, but I would see how for biomedicalization and like turning the patient into bio data and having all of that data, part of the thing with the electronic medical records is that for them, for this time frame, patients cannot access it. Patients cannot determine how they are being read or what is being done with it, but they can have the data taken back to them and become, like, they have to translate themselves into something that the physician can put into the record in a way that is much more restricting than what kind of data is allowed in. So, like, there are examples in the archives that I read of someone with alcoholism where it was all, like, there's like a freehand note that's like a page long and that is reduced down to just alcoholism in the computer notes. And then when it's produced back, the patient has to keep reinterpreting themselves into this alcoholism diagnosis in order to be heard and treated and moved back. But for biomedicalization, you have access to your own data. Like, I know how many steps I walk. I know, like, I have my watch that tells me things. There have been moves to put that data into the electronic medical record and have it be accessible by electronic medical records. Some devices do it better than others. Some of them do already have that existing. That's usually more for things like diabetes and things like that. But you judge yourself by your data. Like, that's part of the biomedicalization, right? Of like seeing yourself and knowing yourself as your quantified self. By making that part of your electronic medical record, it becomes an electronic health record. So all of what you are is defined in this, and everything that changes becomes a medical problem rather than like a lifestyle change or stress change or something like that. So then it becomes difficult to disentangle your electronic health record self from what you've been diagnosed as or what you're like see yourself changing as. I feel like I took a turn there and halfway through. I'm sorry.
Well, thank you so much. As everybody said, it was fantastic. I'm going to ask you about legal liability.
Okay, cool.
Because this is a thread that I want to pull out a little bit because it's interesting, especially from like a patient perspective or a bioethicist perspective. And you teased it a little bit at the end when talking about AI. You know, one of the fears with AI and automation is that it separates the company or the individual from legal culpability, right? Like, we're seeing that with self-driving cars. If a Tesla crashes on self-driving, who do we actually sue, you know? Mm-hmm. And it strikes me that during this process of digitization that there's a sort of similar consideration for health records. So I was thinking about it for like the automation of identifying contravening pharmaceuticals. You know, what if there is this new 1968 paper that just came out and identifies a contravening effect between two medications that didn't get entered into the system? A doctor doesn't catch it. Like, is that the system's fault? Who do I sue in that case? Or vice versa. What if it provokes a contravening pharmaceutical connection that isn't legitimate given the concerns of the patient? It delays treatment, and then the patient ends up suffering as a result. Who do I sue in that case? What are some of the discussions then about legal liability when we start digitizing medical records? And what does that make you think of in terms of how we're approaching the same questions as AI is now filling in the gaps, right? Is like, doctor puts in two words and then the AI recommends the rest of the sentence, you know? Like, that's scary to me about who do we sue if that sentence is wrong. And yeah, I'm just sort of thinking about how these ideas might hang together.
So for the first part about who would be liable in 1968 for the pharmacy things, it would be the pharmacist and the doctor. Okay. So that one's easy because the doctor has to sign off on everything. Okay. Every single bit of it still has to be signed off by the doctor. The pharmacist has to approve it, and the pharmacist is the one who's in charge of the drug formulary. So MGH would probably throw the doctor to the wolves, who would then throw the pharmacist to the wolves. But part of the problem with legal liability in this is that paper is sure. You don't erase things on paper. You cannot erase things on the medical record. If you put in a mistake, you cross it out with a single line so you can still read it, and then you write the new thing, and then the doctor has to initial it to show that it has been confirmed as now correct. It is so much harder to be sure that digital data is accurate and hasn't been changed, particularly at this time frame. Like, nowadays, we have more of like digital auditing to see changes, but in 1968, not so much. And the data could easily just be lost by a weather event. They had problems where there was flooding in the hospital and it destroyed all of their data for the last 2 days. Like, that happens. So the concern for legal liability there is whether that standard will hold up in court the same way paper did. MGH insisted on having paper backups for all data because of that, because they were such a big hospital, because they had an emergency department, because they did have deaths. So they had to have that legal liability. Not so much of a concern for the clinic, much less serious problems. But for nowadays, I'm more concerned about AI in the generating the summaries. They are currently trying to use EHR to generate summaries of the notes from an encounter. So I am concerned about the errors that may be introduced by that, by like similar phrasing but not quite the same phrasing, and then it gets passed from doctor to doctor to doctor, and it's supposed to be communication, but instead it ends up introducing problems. For legal liability there, I think that that is still up in the courts and that AI has not been regulated sufficiently for me to answer that question.
Hi, my name is Ace. Thank you so much for your talk. I found it so engaging.
Thank you.
Who knew medical records could be so interesting? I'm sorry I walked in a few minutes late, so maybe you mentioned this already, but I'm quite curious about, it sounds like medical records were developed to make work for doctors and nurses and those working in the profession easier. And so I'm kind of curious about what the consideration on the patient is with the creation of medical records. Obviously, the users of these records are doctors and nurses and admin, but certainly the patients are impacted by these changes to these technologies and these devices. And thinking about your question around, how do we think about how we create records today for whether or not there should be for today or for thinking about how it could be in the future. I would love your take on should medical records be reconsidered so that it's a little bit, kind of curious about where the patient and how that interaction has changed over time as well.
Absolutely. So that's a great question. So at this time frame that I'm talking about in the 1980s, records still do not belong to the patients, and there is regulations supporting doctors refusing to give records to the patients. Now, there's like a little shorthand or like a sleight of hand thing going on here where the contents of the records technically belong to the patients because it's data about themselves, but the records themselves belong to the hospital because they're the producers of the records. So they can be subpoenaed to have to give the records to the patient, and technically the patients are allowed to see them, but they do not belong to the patient. And that is shown in how they are structured and what the doctors write in them, which is often not very nice things in the records, which continues to be a problem today. But in 2008 with the HITECH Act, they did require that records be accessible to patients. So there was a shift somewhere between the 1980s and 2008 that gives the patients more power. Part of this is the rejection of like a patronizing medicine, of wanting to give the patient more choices in what they're doing. And in order to do that, they have to be informed on their own health. They have to be able to see their own record. Part of it was HIPAA in the 1990s, which covers or separated out what personal health information is, which gives the patient more power to say, that's my PHI, that's my personal health, I need to know it. And by making it have to be accessible to patients, they didn't actually have to make it legible to patients. Patients have to have access to it. They do not have to understand it, which is a common problem both for providers who want their patients to understand it and for providers who don't want their patients to understand it. For providers who want their patients to understand what's going on, they might get a lab result with none of the context, and the provider may not be able to talk to them about what the lab result means until another day or two because of their schedule, because they don't work that day, because they already have surgeries going, something. Which means that the patient then goes and does their own research, but looks at all the statistics and says, oh God, that's a terrible result, when the physician can provide the context and that say, actually, for your age range, this is normal, this is fine. So giving the patients access to the records as it is right now is a double-edged sword because it has not been made accessible and legible. But it does give patients more power. It gives them the ability to take their records to a different provider and get a second opinion. It allows them to see what the providers have written about them, where they couldn't in the 1980s. And some states do technically still have on the books laws that say that physicians don't have to tell patients the entire story, but federal law does overwhelm that.
In practice, actually, I found that it's quite hard to get medical records.
Mm-hmm.
I've had to get all of my immunizations over again for Virginia Tech.
Yeah.
I've spent 5 months trying to find my medical records.
Yes, absolutely. It's much easier with ones that have been developed in the last 5 years.
So Ace stole my question, but don't worry, like Matt, I come prepared with lots of questions. This will be a 7-part question. No, just kidding. Great work. It's really awesome to see you here. My question, I think, actually is more of a follow-up on what Daniel asked, since I was going to ask about patients, and that is like, in what ways was pathology like reduced with the medical records, right? So not just the proliferation of biomedicalization, but was there a reduction given the sort of ways that you could enter in things in those initial records?
That's a great question. I don't know. I can talk about how they were really good at turning things into diagnoses so they could get paid by Medicaid, but I don't know if that actually impacted care so much as billing. I think that there is a difference between how the patients were treated and how it shows up in the record that is difficult for me to disentangle and answer that.
It's always, I don't know is a wonderful answer. So,
I don't know is a great answer.
Here you go. Yeah. No?
Just wet my headphone for
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. I got Phil. I got hands. I'm going to Phil and then to Goodrum.
That was great. That was a great presentation, and you're killing the Q&A too. Like really, I mean, this is just all very impressive. I got a weird question, like just a nerdy question, like about nerds for nerds, and it's about inference logic and creativity. So I was really struck by your saying that that inference was a key to physicians' sort of understanding of their own expertise. Did they say that?
So that was Abbott's phrasing of how physicians see themselves based on his work with psychiatrists, which does bias it a little bit because psychiatrists have less of the like solid objective things to work with, more of the subjective. But it is also shown in some of how doctors talk about themselves in relation to some of these technologies, and about how doctors do the artistry and the connections and the like real life practice of connecting the different information bits, which is how the inference comes in.
Yeah, I would have, if somebody asked me like what a physician's like sort of expertise is, I would say, well, their technique, right? Or something like that. But it could be that the inference is a technique, right? So which technique? So like in deductive logic, right, inference has a kind of like compulsion or necessity to it, like doing a Sudoku, right? There's only one right answer for any square. It's like necessary, right? There's no room for interpretation or kind of like fudging it. But inductive logic maybe is a little bit different, right? Because I think like maybe one of the sort of best ways of thinking about inductive logic is like pattern finding, right? Or pattern identification. And there seems to be more creativity there, right? So what kind of inferences are the computers offering, right? And then I guess, so I'm just curious about kind of like what kinds of inferences doctors see as their kind of, their bread and butter, as it were, like the things that the computer can't do. And it could be that there's certain kind of creativity to logic, right? That's maybe not immediately evident, right? But I don't know. Is that a question?
So I like what you said about deductive and inductive logic, because I think that makes a good separation for Weed and Barnett that I hadn't thought of how Weed really wanted medicine to be deductive. He wanted the computer to be able to represent all of these chains of logic. I didn't go too much into the hardware or software of it, but the way he structures the entire thing is in branching logic trees. So he wants it to be a deductive system.
Sure.
Whereas Barnett recognizes it more as an inductive system and gives more space for the physicians to do whatever they want. And I think that part of that is physicians look at a person and see more than what they can articulate. So it isn't even necessarily creativity, but like you pick up on behavioral cues and on like the things that they say that they aren't quite saying, but you can't really explain that to yourself or to a computer. And part of medicine is learning which things are most realistic out of a range of diagnoses that are available, whereas the computer may say, okay, here's the list of things that match it, and which one is likely based on an overarching statistical percentage. The physician can look at the person and say, okay, well, you fit into X, Y, and Z category of other kinds of nuances that change those probabilities. So it's kind of like Stephen Jay Gould and the median isn't the message kind of thing there. Does that answer your last question? I'm sorry.
No, it's fine.
You give a very vivid depiction of the responses of physicians to what is happening. So I'm a bit interested at the next level up at institutions. And so does an institution like the American Medical Association, do they as an institution, a group of physicians thinking about the future of doctors interacting with these, did institutions ever try to tackle, okay, so individual physicians are having this response, do we as a group of physicians representing physicians, did they ever try to formulate, okay, we actually need to develop a coherent general reaction to this?
Yes, they funded Barnett and they did not fund weed. So that's a good first step. But the American Heart Association in particular really wanted to fund Barnett. He was a cardiologist, so that helps part of it. But he had many cardiologists on staff, specifically because the American Cardiology Association, the American Heart Association, was funding him. So I don't know if the American Medical Association had a set reaction to it. The Hospital Accreditation Association did, and created accreditation standards around it and tried to like encourage people to start meeting it. Part of the problem was the cost of computers meant that they couldn't outright say you should be doing this because they were so expensive to get access to. The American Medical Record Librarians had analyses of these computer systems and thought that weed was overdone and too much work and that their physicians would never agree to it, and that Barnett's system was a great beginning but was not ready for putting into actual practice. So different associations definitely had strong opinions on what was going on and mostly put their money into it or said, this would be cool if you can do it, but don't worry if you can't. They liked the idea of it, but they didn't see it as being viable yet.
I have a question, but let's kick it over to Taylor Loy on Zoom. Uh-oh. Taylor, we can't hear you yet. You're not muted. Oh, we can't hear Zoom in the room. Taylor, while the team figures out how to get your audio, let me ask a quick question. Does that sound good, guys? Yeah.
Hi, Taylor.
Hi, Taylor.
So I have a question. I was thinking while you're talking to kind of think through another kind of model of power. Daniel turned me on to this book, Conflict Sociology by Randall Collins, which has a number of different kind of approaches to thinking about power. And one of the ones he talks about that I just find deeply fascinating is kind of like micro-sociological examinations of like conversations and stuff, and power being about deference, you know? And I was thinking about like, computers are not deferential, I find from like the notifications I get in my pocket. You know, and versus like humans like break it to you easy if there's power involved. Like, you know, if it's like the lab calling a doctor and be like, so Dr. So-and-so, we noticed, you know, and they can kind of like work it out like that. So I just wondered about like, deference in the picture, in places where computers are kind of like undermining deferential relationships. You know what I mean? So it's like, it's not just that the doctor's getting cold hard facts at him or something like that, but that used to come from someone who was like, kind of, stroking them in a kind of conversational way. Yeah.
I think that's absolutely true in context of medical record librarians, who are almost always women and who would be the ones saying, hey, you didn't fill out your medical record all the way. They have an entire chapter in one of their manuals about how to get doctors to agree to fix their records by being nice to them about it. So that is absolutely a very present part of it. And I think that gender would be a big part of it, because the male pharmacist talking to a male doctor would have less of that than I think the female nurses and medical record librarians approaching them.
Make sure to write about that. That's fascinating. Do we have Taylor's audio, Graham? We're having issues over here. So anyone else in the room? Taylor, you want to give it a shot again?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we got it. Go for
Awesome,
it, Taylor.
cool. That's easier. I was trying to type that out, and yeah. So I'll try to make it shorter. I have a question about technological change or technological momentum of these kind of competing medical records paradigms, and how each of these systems deal with change. For example, like the FDA determined that phenylephrine, that common decongestant, doesn't do anything, and most people that try to take it realize it doesn't do anything. But you go to the stores, it's still there. It still has this label on it. It says it does this thing that it doesn't do. So as a kind of a big, large example, so how does that, from the sort of the prescription side, from the doctor side, when these medical records and diagnoses and inferences are kind of plugged into this, either a branching logic or however you want to do, when new stuff comes out, it's like, hey, this doesn't work. How does that get fed back into it and corrected and sort of brought to kind of up to date?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is actually one of the strengths of WEED's system, is because it's centralized. You only need one person to go and change it, and you can have a person who is dedicated to doing that work. So it is work, but with big things like that, where like following the FDA could just be a job and fixing things. Like that would be straightforward and good, and a medical record librarian could be hired for that. For Barnett's system, that's actually more difficult, because the system he created did proliferate. It did go out to other hospitals, but he gave everyone the ability to organize it themselves based on their own nomenclature, based on their own current processes, whatever they had, which meant that each of those individual places would have to update it on their own, based on their own phrasing, which, like, some of them use the standard SNDO, standard diseases and standard nomenclature of diseases and operations. Some of them use SNOMED. Some of them used ICD. You have to fit this one event into like 7 different nomenclatures to get it out. Whereas WEED is just, this is what we do. We're good.
All right, it's almost 3, but we could take maybe one more question in the room.
Okay. Yen was first. Keep it brief.
All right, I'm first, excellent and very vivid depiction of the history of EHR, and also sorry, Dong Hong, I just steal your opportunities. I want to follow Tyler's question, because Tyler asked a question about technological momentums and technological change. And I have a question about technological diffusion. That since you mentioned that both Barnett and WEED, they don't achieve a fully success in the United States. Did they got a chance to find a second opportunity in other country? Especially right now, every country, every professional medical institute, they have their EHR systems.
Yeah. So WEEDS stayed very much in America. Not surprising, because the entire system was already written in English, and all of that knowledge would have to be translated into it, not just language translation even, but to translate into the UK's classification system would already be work. But Barnett created a medical language called MUMPS, like a programming language, And that was very popular in Germany. It was very popular in Japan. It was somewhat popular in Brazil, but didn't really get a foothold there. And that had a whole grassroots movement. They had mumps users group meetings that went across the country to all these different places. Because they were at MGH, they also had a rotating series of visiting doctors coming in, and those scholars went out and spread the good mumps word. And so like they ended up with one in like Vancouver that had a whole setup. And so that one very much spread more. And that's part of why that language persists today in EPIC, the EHR system that is like the most dominant one for the United States, because that language had enough of a foothold that it could develop into that way. But notably, while they did have a standard for the language with the American National Standards Institute, that went defunct in 1999, and now that has separated into a couple core implementations. So MUMPS has separated out and is no longer the giant it was.
So after the culture, after the religious revolution, then it's
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rowan.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
Two things. Thank you to Mandy and Graham for doing a good job running a 2-person show today in the room. Thank you. And are we going to go grab a sandwich or something? So if you want to go grab a meal or something with us, everyone's welcome, okay?
A quick announcement.
Yeah.
We don't have a seminar next week, and then the following week is Thanksgiving. So our next seminar is December 6th. And we're going to have a workshop and seminar both on like disability access and democracy. So look out for an announcement about that next week. Thank you, guys.